A discovery that would permanently alter our understanding of the depths of human depravity was made in the spring of 1834, somewhere in the undulating hills of central Virginia. In a cellar beneath what seemed like a typical home, 47 children, ages 6 to 16, were discovered chained. When asked, the children could only murmur one name through their tears: Mother Sullivan. They also spoke various languages and had little resemblance to one another. 3 of the investigating officers quit their jobs within a week after reading the local sheriff's report, which has been preserved at the Henrico County Archives for more than a century. The disturbing discovery that Constance Sullivan had been running her perverse business for more than 20 years, undetected, is what really makes this case eerie, not simply the tragedy of what was discovered. The children referred to her as Mother, but the meaning of that word would turn out to be much worse than anyone could have predicted. I want to ask you a crucial question before we get started with the Sullivan family's narrative and their unimaginable secrets. This channel is just for the most courageous individuals who dare to take on the most sinister periods in American history. You're different from most people if you've read this far. You know that some facts, no matter how much they annoy us, are just too terrible to overlook. Click subscribe to become a part of our community of real mystery seekers. Additionally, let me know in the comments which state you are listening from. Do you have the courage to hear tales like this from people in your own neighborhood? How such a large enterprise could have remained undiscovered for so long in a small, rural hamlet is the conundrum that plagued investigators back then and still baffles historians today. In 1834, Virginia was a place torn between two worlds. While rumors of industrial revolution floated down from the north, the old plantation system continued to dominate the social scene. In this context, Millbrook, a small farming village of around 50 people dispersed over the gentle hillsides of Henrico County, reflected the average rural American community of the time. In addition to trading at Henderson's General Store and gathering for social events at the one-room schoolhouse that served as a community meeting hall, the majority of the locals cultivated maize or tobacco. The Sullivan property, a modest 2-story wooden farmhouse encircled by over 200 acres of prime agricultural land, was located on the outskirts of this hamlet. The Sullivan farm looked very ordinary to anyone driving down the dusty road that ran from Millbrook to Richmond. The home itself had a wraparound porch, which is characteristic of Virginia architecture, and white-painted clapboard siding, both of which were features of the Federal style that was popular in the 1810 seconds. Behind the home, a red barn stood 60 yards away, and the standard agricultural design included a smokehouse and chicken coop. From the road, it was impossible to see what was special about the Sullivan property. The house's basement had been extensively expanded by Ezra Sullivan, who had bought the property in 1809 with funds from his father's tobacco business. Although the majority of homes in Virginia at that time period had basic root cellars, the Sullivan basement was much larger than the house above. Although none had seen the finished job, local artisans recalled being engaged for a variety of excavation projects in the 1810 seconds and 1820 seconds. Ezra gave staff good pay in cash and asked that they concentrate on the tasks they were given rather than the project as a whole. Ezra's wife, Constance Sullivan, had come to Millbrook in 1811 as a 22-year-old bride. She was a dark-haired, attractive woman with an extraordinarily gentle voice, according to the neighbors. She kept up a reputation for doing good deeds, dressed simply but neatly, and attended Methodist church services when her health allowed. Constance would unavoidably respond that she and Ezra were already providing care for a number of orphaned children from her family back in Pennsylvania when asked about supporting local charities. The arrangement, she added, was temporary, merely until suitable permanent houses could be found. The community's interest in the sporadic sightings of kids on the Sullivan property was satiated by this explanation. Occasionally, when Constance came to town for supplies, Mrs. Henderson, who worked at the general store, would notice a young face peeking from the Sullivan wagon. Constance would explain that the children were shy, upset by the loss of their parents, and required time to acclimate to their new situation, even if they never talked. The community accepted these answers without inquiry, since they were aware of the tragedy of orphaned children during a time when mortality rates were high. Later, the general store owner, Thomas Henderson, remarked that one of his most dependable clients was Constance Sullivan. She would show up every 2 weeks with a thorough list and enough money to buy large amounts of staple goods like molasses, cornmeal, wheat, salt pork, and other necessities. Constance would remind Thomas of the orphan children whenever he brought up the amount, which seemed excessive for a childless marriage. She also made unusual purchases of basic medications, stating that children from low-income families frequently arrived with a variety of illnesses that needed to be treated. Some neighbors were perplexed by the Sullivan farm's routine. Activity at the Sullivan property frequently lasted well into the evening, in contrast to most farming families who got up with the sun and worked until twilight. At odd hours, lights might be seen in the farmhouse windows, and at night, the sound of construction or hammering occasionally reverberated across the fields. Ezra would respond that he was making adjustments to meet the increasing number of youngsters under his care when questioned about these activities. The Millbrook area's traveling physician, Dr. Marcus Whitfield, recalled being called to the Sullivan farm multiple times in the 1,820 seconds and early 1,830 seconds. Every time, he was informed that one of the orphans had become unwell and required medical care. But Dr. Whitfield was never allowed to perform a direct examination on the children. Constance would instead list the symptoms and ask for particular drugs. Constance would explain that the youngsters were too traumatized by their experiences and too afraid of strangers to consent to being examined by unknown men when the doctor insisted on seeing his patients. Even the local clergyman, Reverend Samuel Matthews, was duped into believing in the Sullivan family's philanthropic endeavors. Reverend Matthews would occasionally visit the farm and commend Constance and Ezra for their Christian charity in providing care for so many unhappy youngsters. Constance would constantly respond that she was already in contact with relatives in Pennsylvania who would eventually accept the children, even though he promised to assist in finding the orphans permanent homes. She told him that the procedure only needed careful planning and patience. No one in the neighborhood knew that Constance Sullivan had spent more than 20 years honing her deceit. The orphans weren't just short-term guests hoping to be adopted by caring families. They were confined in conditions that would have made even the most seasoned criminals cry in anguish. They were either bought, abducted, or enticed away from their families in various states. A string of seemingly unconnected events in the first few months of 1834 set the stage for the revelation that would reveal the terrible secrets of the Sullivan family. February had been particularly severe, with weeks of temperatures well below freezing. For the 47 youngsters stranded beneath the Sullivan farmhouse, the intense cold that swept over Virginia that winter would be both a boon and a bane. A traveling trader called Jacob Stern was going from Richmond to Charlottesville on the 23rd of February, 1834, when he was compelled to seek refuge due to a severe snowstorm. Since it was the nearest structure to the road, the Sullivan farm appeared like a logical choice for emergency housing. Even though he was clearly reluctant, Ezra Sullivan could hardly turn away a stranded passenger in such hazardous conditions. Stern subsequently characterized the night as uncomfortable and unpleasant. Constance Sullivan provided a straightforward supper of salt pork and cornmeal, but the conversation was unpleasant and stiff. The Sullivans looked at each other all the time, and they started at every sound, as if they were nervous. Constance assured Stern that all of the youngsters he had been told lived on the farm were asleep and should not be woken. She said that the kids needed to relax since they had a fever. The sound was the most upsetting thing to Stern. He lay on a makeshift bed in the Sullivan parlor during the night, hearing what sounded like muffled sobbing from under the floor. The following morning, when he brought this up to Ezra, Sullivan asserted that it was most likely only wind blowing through foundation cracks. In older homes, the sound was typical, particularly in colder climates. Stern agreed with this explanation, but he was nonetheless bothered by the Sullivans' demeanor. 3 weeks later, on March 15th, the second event took place. A young Irish immigrant named Mary Catherine Flynn became separated from her family while crossing a river when they were looking for work in the tobacco fields near Richmond. She traveled to the Sullivan farm, exhausted and terrified. Constance Sullivan took her in when night fell, providing food and a place to stay. Mary Catherine never came back to life. Her family gave the Richmond sheriff a description of their last known location and the direction Mary Catherine had been traveling when they filed a missing persons report. Although a search team was assembled, it was practically impossible to locate a single missing individual due to the size of the Virginia backcountry. After a week, the search was canceled, and it was assumed that Mary Catherine Flynn had either been murdered by wild animals or died from exposure. On the 2nd of April 1834, the last event that would result in the discovery took place, when William Hutchinson, a neighboring farmer, heard something that stopped him cold. He was hunting rabbits in the woods that surrounded the Sullivan property. The sound of children screaming, not the typical cries of children playing, but unadulterated, frantic shrieks of sheer terror, came from somewhere close to the Sullivan farmhouse. About 50 yards from the Sullivan house, Hutchinson slipped closer to investigate, lurking behind a clump of oak trees. He listened and watched for almost an hour. The wailing persisted sporadically, always coming from underneath the house instead of inside. On one occasion, he caught sight of Ezra Sullivan coming out of what looked like a cellar entrance on the side of the home. With an apprehensive glance around, Sullivan vanished back beneath. Opinions differed when Hutchinson told his neighbors what he had seen. According to others, the orphan children might be more distressed than the Sullivans had said, and they might need upsetting medical care or punishment. Others, on the other hand, started to recall weird facts that had not previously seemed significant. The enormous quantities of food that Constance Sullivan bought, the odd noises that neighbors occasionally heard at night, and the fact that none of the alleged orphans had ever been spotted in the town or at community events. At first, Henrico County Sheriff Benjamin Crawford, a seasoned law enforcement officer with more than 15 years of experience, wrote off the worries as local rumors. But Crawford consented to look into it after William Hutchinson went straight to him and demanded that a formal complaint be made. No matter how he felt about the accusers, he was obligated by law to investigate allegations of possible child abuse. Sheriff Crawford and his deputy Marcus Webb rode out to the Sullivan property early on the 8th of April, 1834. Expecting to perform a standard examination that would dispel the local tales, they arrived shortly after morning. Constance Sullivan greeted them at the door in a composed and kind manner. She said she was worried about the rumors going around the neighborhood and invited the officers in for coffee. The chat started off in a typical manner. Constance gave the officers a second explanation of the orphaned children, showed them letters she said she had received from relatives in Pennsylvania, and promised to set up a meeting between the kids and Sheriff Crawford after they were well enough to see him. Until Deputy Webb requested to use the privy, everything appeared to be entirely acceptable. Webb's blood ran cold when he came around the side of the house and saw that the cellar door, which William Hutchinson had witnessed Ezra Sullivan using, was locked with 3 different padlocks. As though someone had attempted to scrape their way out from within, heavy chains were wrapped around the doorknobs, and there were marks of desperate clawing on the wood surrounding the locks. Both men realized they were dealing with something much more serious than neighborhood rumors when Webb went back inside and discreetly told Sheriff Crawford what he had seen. Constance was graciously requested to show them the cellar by Crawford, who explained that a careful examination would help dispel the rumors. Constance Sullivan's expression changed instantly, and it was icy. Her face turned white. Her hands started to shake, and she started stuttering about how the cellar was unsafe, how kids weren't supposed to go down there, and how all that was visible was storage and outdated agricultural equipment. They heard it at that moment. A faint voice begging for assistance was followed by the sound of youngsters sobbing from somewhere beneath their feet. They stood precisely beneath the kitchen, and the sound, muted but distinct, came from that direction. Sheriff Crawford would live with the consequences of that initial discovery for the rest of his life. The basement that Ezra Sullivan had spent more than 20 years building was a masterwork of deliberate cruelty, and when he and Deputy Webb pried open the cellar door, the stench rising from the darkness below was overwhelming, a mixture of human waste, unwashed bodies, and something else that Crawford later referred to as the smell of despair itself. The main chamber extended into the ground like a subterranean labyrinth, much beyond the house's footprint above. A network of connected chambers was formed by meticulously mortared stone walls that were intended to reduce noise. The majority of the youngsters lived in the largest chamber, which was located right beneath the kitchen. Each child had shackles fastened around their ankles, and they were all shackled to iron rings set into the stone walls. Although there was no chance of escape, the chains were long enough to provide mobility inside a constrained space. The children were between the ages of 6 and 16. Their bodies bore the scars of years of abuse and neglect, and they were malnourished, their clothing reduced to rags. Numerous people displayed symptoms of disease, including fever, respiratory issues, and skin disorders, brought on by residing in the moist, poorly ventilated subterranean area. The stillness was what hit both policemen the hardest. The youngsters remained silent after the first cries for assistance. They merely gazed at the newcomers, with eyes devoid of anticipation or hope for help. The father of 4, Deputy Webb, had to leave the basement twice to throw up. Despite his years of experience in law enforcement, Sheriff Crawford was unable to comprehend the full extent of what he was witnessing. He had never experienced or imagined anything like the systematic structure of the incarceration, the proof of extensive preparation, or the sheer volume of victims. Crawford and Webb discovered indications of the Sullivan system of control in the smaller rooms. There were punitive restraining devices and stocks in one room. Another housed what seemed like a rudimentary medical facility, where the kids were treated for wounds and ailments, not out of sympathy, but to keep them alive and able to function. Names, ages, dates of arrival, and comments on each child's condition and behavior were among the comprehensive data in a third room that would be essential to the investigation. The Sullivan operation's extent was made clear by the documents. Since 1812, not long after Constance Sullivan arrived in Millbrook, children had been coming to the farm on a regular basis. The sources were diverse. Some were orphans taken from overburdened, impoverished homes. Others fled after being seduced by the promise of food and shelter. Others seemed to have just been abducted from their families. More than 90 kids have gone through the Sullivan basement throughout the years, according to the documents. The most frightening response was given to the obvious question: what had happened to the others? Crawford and Webb discovered the remains of at least 36 children in a different room, accessible only by crawling through a small opening. A few seemed to have perished from disease or starvation. Others displayed violent tendencies. Their bodies were coated with lime to prevent rotting and stink, and they had all been laid to rest in shallow graves beneath the basement floor. As officials tried to figure out how such a large criminal organization had gone unnoticed for more than 20 years, the inquiry that followed the first finding would drag on for months. Constance Sullivan's aptitude for deceit and her knowledge of human psychology held the key to the solution. She had developed a character that was nearly ideal for evading suspicion in a small town in the 1,830 seconds. In addition to explaining away any oddities in the Sullivan household, the character of the philanthropic woman who cared for orphaned children spoke to the Christian ideals of the neighborhood. An easy way to explain why the alleged orphans were never seen in public was to tell the tale of traumatized kids who were too afraid to engage with others. The youngsters never appeared to leave the farm, which was explained by the assertion that permanent homes were being found with distant relatives. Constance had even more ingeniously built several levels of security for her organization. By teaching the kids to refer to her as Mother, they made it sound like a natural family bond to anyone who might overhear them. Children had been carefully trained to be silent and appear shy, rather than scared the few times they had been seen by strangers. The presence of several children was used to justify the large food purchases, and the alleged poor health of the orphaned children was used to justify the medical supplies. The operation's physical setup was just as carefully thought out. Many years had passed while the basement was being built, with various laborers working on different parts of the project. Not a single craftsman had viewed the entire plan or realized why the changes were made. Even near neighbors hardly ever heard anything untoward since the soundproofing was so good. When they did, the noises may be attributed to typical farm activities or the typical sounds made by kids playing. Constance's approach of psychological control was perhaps the most unsettling. The youngsters were informed that the outside world was hostile and dangerous, that no one was searching for them, and that their families had abandoned them. Properly behaving people had somewhat better living and food situations, The penalties meted out to troublemakers were meant to set an example for the others. The majority of the kids eventually came to terms with the fact that they were in captivity, since it was just how their lives were supposed to be. The finding was met with utter shock and incredulity by the community. At first, a lot of locals didn't think Constance Sullivan, the peaceful woman who had lived with them for more than 20 years, could be capable of such horrible things. Some said the whole thing was a mistake, or that she must have been forced by her spouse. As more evidence surfaced, it became impossible to maintain these denials. The extensive documents discovered in the basement contained correspondence with criminal contacts in other states, in addition to details about the children. Constance Sullivan was a member of a child trafficking organization that bought and sold young victims between states. From Pennsylvania to Georgia, the Sullivan farm was only one part of a broader criminal business. As Sheriff Crawford investigated the Sullivan case further, troubling trends emerged that indicated the scheme was much more complex than first thought. Constance Sullivan had been in regular contact with at least 12 other people in 5 states, all of whom appeared to be engaged in similar activities, according to correspondence discovered in the basement. The letters described merchandise, deliveries, and quality control in terminology that was obviously related to human trafficking. They were written in a straightforward code that was finally decoded. 3 months before to the finding, a letter from a Philadelphia resident known only as Morrison was received. The letter contained thorough details of the children, their ages, and their physical states, and Morrison added that he had 6 new items of varying ages and conditions that would be suitable for your requirements. The most upsetting part was that it had notes about their temperaments, indicating which kids were obedient and which could need additional training. The picture that emerged from the financial documents was even more horrific. Depending on the age and condition of each child, Constance Sullivan had been paying anywhere from $50 to $200. Additionally, she had been getting payments from other places, indicating that the Sullivan farm was a place where trafficking children were both transported and distributed. Over $8,000 in transactions over 2 decades, or several $100,000 in modern currencies, was an astounding amount of money for the time. As the investigation progressed, Dr. Marcus Whitfield, the traveling doctor who had been called to the Sullivan property multiple times, became a crucial witness. Constance Sullivan had always been extremely specific about the meds she required, he disclosed when questioned. She was well versed in treating respiratory infections, malnourishment, and other ailments that are typical in youngsters who have been neglected. Additionally, she had requested sedatives and other medications that may be used to manage challenging inmates. Another terrifying insight came from the doctor's testimony. Constance Sullivan had been methodically researching ways to sustain a large number of children in the face of severe hardship. Everything she did, including the questions she asked, the medical supplies she bought, and even the basement's layout, was planned to increase the inmates' chances of survival while using the fewest resources possible to keep them well. Thomas Henderson, a local businessman, contributed more puzzle pieces. Constance Sullivan had been buying more and more basic supplies over the years, according to an examination of his sales records. What looked like the escalating requirements of a philanthropic home turned out to be proof of a developing criminal enterprise. Henderson also recalled particular requests for things that were out of the ordinary at the time, such extra blankets, a lot of kids' clothes, and huge purchases of basic medications. The probe also uncovered Ezra Sullivan's involvement in the scheme. Ezra was in charge of the prison's physical upkeep and the care of the inmates, but Constance seemed to be the mastermind. When able to communicate, some of the survivors characterized him as the enforcer who enforced discipline and administered penalties. His work on the basement had involved more than just expansion. It had involved ongoing improvement of a system intended to confine humans. Examining the records of kids who had vanished from the Sullivan farm throughout the years yielded the most unsettling discovery. A network of buyers and sellers spanning several states was suggested by the ledgers, which revealed that some children had been moved to other locations. Others had been labeled problematic or unsuitable entries that matched the bodies discovered in the burial chamber in the basement. As investigators in other states started looking into their own mysterious disappearances, the investigation's breadth grew. Reports of missing children from North Carolina, South Carolina, Maryland, and Pennsylvania revealed unsettling parallels. Numerous missing children matched the characteristics of the ones discovered at the Sullivan farm. They were either impoverished, orphaned, or came from households that lacked the means to conduct a thorough search for them. The multi-state inquiry was coordinated by federal marshals. Since the majority of law enforcement at the time was strictly local, this was unprecedented. One of the first significant criminal investigations to include federal agents and span state lines was the Sullivan case. Many of the offenses had taken place in separate jurisdictions with different laws, which compounded the legal ramifications. More survivors started sharing their testimonies as the weeks went by. The stories, which detailed years of incarceration, institutionalized torture, and psychological manipulation, were very similar. According to the youngsters, newcomers were broken in, isolated, punished, and brainwashed until they came to terms with their lot in life. They described a complicated structure among the inmates, where older kids had limited privileges in return for assisting in the supervision of younger ones. The scope of Constance Sullivan's psychological manipulation was also disclosed by the survivors. Many of the youngsters had been persuaded by her that they were unworthy, that their families had abandoned or sold them, and that they should be treated as such. Since they had been raised to think that the outside world was even more frightening than their confinement, several of the older children, who had been detained for years, first opposed rescue attempts. Evidence of Sullivan's victim acquisition strategies was found during the investigation. At impoverished homes and orphanages, she had cultivated connections with dishonest officials who would give children in return for money. Additionally, she had developed relationships with criminal elements in large cities who were able to identify youngsters who were at risk, such as runaways, street orphans, and others who would not be missed right away. The records revealed that the Sullivan operation had been growing in recent years, which was perhaps the most disturbing aspect. The number of youngsters in custody had grown, and the email contained plans to create comparable facilities elsewhere. Evidently, a criminal activity that was about to grow into a much larger operation was halted by the discovery at the Sullivan farm. Unexpectedly, the discovery that would result in the full disclosure of the Sullivan network was made. One of the girls that survived was a girl named Rebecca, who was about 14 years old and had been detained longer than the others. Rebecca had retained a spark of rebellion and an exceptional memory for details, in contrast to the other youngsters who had been broken by their trauma. When Rebecca was 9 years old in 1829, she was abducted from her family's Pennsylvania farm. She recalled every detail of her arrest, including how she had woken up tied in the Sullivan basement, how a woman posing as a distant aunt had come at their farm, and how she had been enticed away with promises of candy and a ride to town. Better yet, she recalled all the exchanges she had heard between Constance Sullivan and the other guests who had visited the farm over the years. According to Rebecca's testimony, the Sullivan operation was only a small portion of a much bigger network. She had overheard Constance talking about other farms, other places where kids were being detained. Names, dates, and specifics of shipments of kids being transferred between facilities were all in her memory. Law enforcement had their first thorough image of the size of the criminal operation thanks to her information. Rebecca's description of a visit that had taken place only 2 weeks prior to the finding was the most important revelation. Along with 2 other men, a well-dressed man had driven up to the farm in a fancy carriage. Rebecca and 3 other kids had been chosen to be inspected by the guests. Like a buyer assessing livestock, the man had closely inspected them, assessing their general health, muscle tone, and teeth. The visitor had left behind a note with particular requirements for the kind of children he wished to buy, but in the end, he had opted not to buy any of them, claiming they were too damaged for his purposes. The letter, discovered in Constance Sullivan's documents, outlined specifications for kids with particular ages, physical attributes, and temperaments. Humans were discussed as commodities to be bought and sold in a chilly, businesslike tone. H. Blackwood signed the letter, which had Charleston, South Carolina as the return address. Henry Blackwood was a wealthy plantation owner who had been buying children for years, supposedly as domestic help, but for reasons that would turn out to be much more heinous than the Sullivan scheme. According to the investigation's findings, the case gained a completely new dimension as a result of the Blackwood link. It seemed that the child trafficking network had been used by Southern plantation owners to recruit laborers who would be totally controlled by them. Trafficked children might be worked to death with no legal repercussions, in contrast to enslaved individuals who had certain legal safeguards and whose disappearance may be noted. They had no prospect of escape, no legal status to protect them, and no family to look for them. According to the Blackwood Connection probe, comparable acquisitions had been made by a number of other well-known Southern families. In addition to being utilized as workers, the youngsters were also being used as targets for violent amusement, as participants for medical studies, and for other purposes that the investigators felt were too upsetting to fully detail in their official findings. Strong interest began to oppose the probe as the size of the criminal network became apparent. Many of the families that bought children had strong political ties and ample financial means to defend themselves. Threats were made against witnesses, investigators, and even the children who were still alive. Anonymous letters cautioning Sheriff Crawford to end the probe were sent to him. Unknown attackers attacked Deputy Webb as he was making his way home from work. A number of well-known patients abruptly boycotted Dr. Whitfield's practice. It was obvious that the pressure was intended to scare law enforcement and keep the network's entire scope hidden. When a youngster named Timothy, one of the surviving children who had been giving important testimony, vanished from the makeshift shelter where he was being held, the situation grew even more precarious. Despite a search, Timothy was never located. The message was unmistakable. Anyone who assisted with the probe would suffer dire repercussions. The investigation proceeded in spite of the intimidation. Key investigators and witnesses were further secured by federal marshals. Armed guards were stationed at the Sullivan farm to safeguard the tangible evidence, and the remaining children were relocated to safer areas. The case had evolved into a test of the ability of the American legal system to handle crimes committed by powerful and wealthy individuals. When Constance Sullivan was discovered dead in her detention cell, the pressure peaked. Although suicide was stated as the official cause of death, the circumstances raised doubts. Sullivan was supposed to provide testimony regarding the whole scope of the criminal network, including the identities of all her clients and associates. Her passing removed the key witness and information source of the larger scheme from the investigation. The investigation team was rocked by Constance Sullivan's unexplained demise. No one in the case was safe if influential parties were prepared to remove important witnesses. A criminal business so large and so well-connected that it threatened some of the most powerful families in American society had been discovered by the investigation. An unforeseen incident changed everything just as it appeared that violence and intimidation may derail the probe. Motivated by guilt over what he had seen, a former employee of Henry Blackwood came forward with information that would completely unravel the case. The worker, Samuel Pierce, had been an overseer on the Blackwood plantation and knew the children who had been bought from the Sullivan network in great detail. Documents that demonstrated the link between the Southern buyers and the Sullivan operation were presented with Pierce. More significantly, he had seen firsthand what happened to a large number of the kids who were sold to plantation owners. His testimony would reveal the complete horror of what had been happening to America's most vulnerable children and supply the last pieces of the puzzle. One of the most unsettling testimonies in American legal history was Samuel Pierce's evidence before the federal grand jury in Richmond. For more than 10 years, Pierce, a man in his 40s with aged hands and haunting eyes, had been employed by Henry Blackwood. Even the seasoned investigators who believed they grasped the extent of the illicit operation were taken aback by what he had witnessed on the Blackwood estate and what he said about the fate of the Sullivan children. Pierce explained the operation of two distinct systems on the Blackwood plantation. Operating under the common, if harsh, economic model of Southern agriculture, the primary plantation produced cotton using enslaved labor. But Blackwood had also set up what Pierce referred to as the experimental quarters, a different facility where the youngsters who had been trafficked were detained for reasons unrelated to farming. Blackwood, along with a number of accomplices, including 2 doctors from Charleston Medical College, utilized the infants he bought from the Sullivan network as subjects for medical research. The purpose of the trials was to satisfy the scientific curiosity of men who saw the children as laboratory animals rather than human beings, to test the boundaries of human endurance, and to examine the effects of various medications and treatments. Blackwood kept meticulous notes of these studies, which became the subject of Pierce's most devastating evidence. Everything was recorded by the plantation owner, including the children's responses to various therapies, their survival rates in varied environments, and the development of diseases that were purposefully introduced in order to examine their effects. According to the documents, Blackwood and his colleagues had been carrying out systematic torture under the pretense of medical study. At least 37 children from the Sullivan network had been sold to Blackwood throughout the years, according to the testimony. Only 4 of them had made it to the point where they might be passed on to future purchasers. Malnutrition, the harsh working conditions in the experimental quarters, or the experiments themselves had killed the others. Their remains had been interred in an isolated area of the estate in unmarked graves. Pierce also gave details regarding the larger purchasing network. He had attended meetings when Blackwood had talked purchases with affluent businessmen, politicians, and other plantation owners. The trafficking network was much larger than detectives had thought, according to the discussions he overheard. All around the nation, children were being purchased and sold, with various buyers having various needs and goals. When Pierce recounted a meeting he had seen in the fall of 1833, the most startling information was revealed. A demonstration was held by Blackwood for prospective purchasers from all across the South. The purpose of the event was to highlight the caliber of youngsters that are accessible through the network and to display the range of applications that they may be used for. Some grand jurors were forced to leave the room after hearing Pierce's distressing account of this meeting. Displays of the children's aptitude for different kinds of labor, their reactions to various forms of control and punishment, and their appropriateness for various sorts of exploitation were all part of the exhibition. The buyers had been urged to order particular victim types, test the children's emotions, and take a careful look at them. It had all taken place in the informal, business-like setting of a livestock auction. Pierce's evidence also exposed the network's financial reach. Depending on the child's age, physical condition, and planned purpose, the prices paid varied significantly. Younger children were more expensive since they were easier to discipline and control. Children with certain physical traits or skills were sold for higher prices. According to estimates, the network's entire financial investment was in the hundreds of thousands of dollars, which was a fortune at the time. Pierce's intelligence was used by the investigating team to plan raids on several sites around the South. Together with local law enforcement, federal marshals launched simultaneous attacks on plantations, warehouses, and other locations housing trafficked children. To avoid destroying evidence and allowing important offenders to evade capture, the raids were carried out in secret. The coordinated raids had astounding consequences. More than 100 other kids were saved from different places. Financial records, communications, and thorough logs of purchases and sales were among the tangible evidence that was recovered and revealed the whole scope of the trafficking network. Henry Blackwood, 2 Charleston Medical College doctors, and a Georgia state lawmaker who had been one of the network's most loyal patrons, were among the notable people arrested. The nation was outraged by the proof of systematic evil that was found during the raids. Hundreds of children had been harmed by the trafficking network, which had been in operation for more than 30 years and featured dozens of significant buyers and vendors. For any criminal business of the era, the degree of sophistication and organization was unheard of. Blackwood and his colleagues' medical experiments were chronicled in graphic detail. According to the records, the experimenters tested different poisons and toxins, performed surgeries without anesthesia or the necessary medical skills, and purposefully afflicted infants with ailments to track their evolution. The kids had been viewed as expendable study subjects, and the only value placed on their lives was the scientific information that might be gleaned from their agony. The corruption that had enabled the network was also exposed by the probe. Local governments, poorhouses, and orphanage officials had been bought off to either give children or to overlook their disappearances. Judges had been paid to authorize adoptions that were really sales, or to declare infants abandoned. Even some police officers had participated in witness intimidation and evidence concealment. Years would pass throughout the ensuing judicial proceedings as prosecutors battled to provide victims of crimes that had taken place in several states and jurisdictions with justice. Prosecution was very challenging due to the intricacy of the case and the riches and political ties of many of the defendants. Due to technical issues or the influence of strong allies, a number of important defendants were not found guilty. But the trafficking network's public disclosure had significant repercussions that went well beyond the court case. The first federal law addressing child abuse and trafficking was sparked by the Sullivan case. It resulted in the creation of additional legislative safeguards for children in danger, as well as changes to the supervision of poorhouses and orphanages. Although it would take almost 5 years to reach a final resolution, the Sullivan case had an immediate and significant impact on American culture. The public's response to the revelations was one of shocked interest, combined with a resolve to keep such crimes from occurring in the future. Numerous newspapers nationwide devoted entire issues to the investigation's conclusions, covering the tale in previously unheard-of depth. The road to rehabilitation was lengthy and challenging for the youngsters who survived. The majority had been detained for years and had no recollection of their previous lives. It took a lot of medical attention, psychological support, and patient work to assist the 47 kids who were saved from the Sullivan basement reintegrate into society. Many suffered from emotional and physical wounds for the rest of their lives, never fully recovering from their tragedy. As word of Rebecca's bravery spread, the 4-year-old girl whose testimony had been essential to exposing the larger network gained some notoriety. But for a person who had experienced such pain, the attention was overpowering. Eventually, she was taken to a Quaker family in Pennsylvania, who gave her the calm, nurturing atmosphere she required to recover. Rebecca finally got married and started a family after living to be 73 years old. However, following the trial testimony, she never again discussed her experiences in public. The entire scope of the corruption that had made the trafficking network possible was made clear by the court procedures. Captured during the first raid, Ezra Sullivan was found guilty on several counts of kidnapping, incarceration, and murder. On the 15th of November 1836, he was hanged in Richmond in front of more than 3,000 spectators. Witnesses said his final words were a confession that he had followed the devil's path and a request for the youngsters he had assisted in torturing to forgive him. The trial of Henry Blackwood caused a stir and revealed the sinister side of Southern plantation life. Even seasoned observers were appalled by the evidence of systematic torture and murder found in the medical records taken from his plantation. Despite being found guilty of several murders and given the death penalty, Blackwood's execution was postponed for years due to political scheming and appeals. Although some believed he had been poisoned by allies who were afraid he may divulge more secrets, he ultimately passed away in prison in 1841, allegedly from a heart attack. The 2 Charleston Medical College doctors who had taken part in the tests received lengthy prison sentences and were barred from practicing medicine. New laws controlling medical research and the handling of human subjects were enacted as a result of their instances. Investigators found that numerous other faculty members were aware of the illicit experiments but had not reported them, causing a scandal at the medical institution that almost led to its demise. The amount of influential people who dodged justice despite overwhelming evidence of their involvement was the most frustrating part of the investigation. Before they could be apprehended, a number of affluent plantation owners escaped to Europe. Others avoided prosecution or received light sentences that were insufficient for the seriousness of their crimes by using their political connections. Despite being censured by his legislature, a Georgia state senator who had been a big consumer of the network was never charged with a crime. According to the financial analysis, the trafficking network's operators made huge sums of money. Over the course of her 20-year business, Constance Sullivan alone had made over $12,000 in earnings, which is several $100,000 in today's currency. Since a large portion of this money had been invested in respectable companies or concealed in accounts that investigators were unable to locate, it was never retrieved. The actual Sullivan farm came to represent the atrocities that had been discovered. Although the government took possession of the property and subsequently sold it at auction, nobody wanted to live in an area connected to such depravity. The basement was filled with concrete and sealed off when the house was dismantled in 1845. To honor the children who had perished there, a modest cemetery was built, albeit the majority of their names were never revealed. Significant changes to child care and protection were brought about by the case. By requiring background checks for anybody looking to adopt or care for a significant number of children and establishing government monitoring of orphanages, Virginia approved the first comprehensive child protection legislation in American history. Similar laws were swiftly passed by other states, laying the groundwork for contemporary child welfare programs. In response, the federal government also passed new legislation to combat human trafficking and interstate crimes. The limitations of state-by-state law enforcement in handling offenses that transcended jurisdictional lines were illustrated in the Sullivan case. Marshals were granted more power to look into and prosecute trafficking offenses under new federal statutes, setting precedents that would be important in further advancements in the criminal justice system. Most significantly, the case altered public perceptions about children's vulnerability and the necessity of systemic protection. A more practical recognition of the necessity of institutional supervision and legal protections took the place of the idealistic picture of the philanthropic person taking care of orphaned children. As a warning about the possibility of abuse in circumstances involving vulnerable children, the phrase "another Sullivan case" became widely used. The remainder of Dr. Marcus Whitfield's career was devoted to child welfare. He was the doctor who, via his medical consultations, had unwittingly made the Sullivan surgery possible. He became an advocate for changes in medical practice that would shield doctors from being influenced by criminals and founded free clinics exclusively for orphaned and abandoned children. His involvement with the Sullivan case had a significant impact on his subsequent publications on medical ethics. After being promoted to federal marshal, Sheriff Benjamin Crawford, who had spearheaded the initial investigation, continued to pursue similar cases for the remainder of his career. He developed investigative methods and procedures that would be employed for decades, making him one of the first law enforcement officers to focus on crimes against minors. Law enforcement officials nationwide were forced to read Crawford's in-depth findings on the Sullivan case. As the children's tales developed over time, they demonstrated both the long-term consequences of systemic abuse and the full extent of human resiliency. With the right care and assistance, some people, like Rebecca, were able to lead comparatively normal lives. Others battled addiction, mental illness, and other issues brought on by their horrific experiences. Some never fully healed, passing away at a young age due to difficulties brought on by years of abuse and incarceration. For years following the first discovery, investigators used the network's correspondence, which had been maintained as evidence, to uncover information that resulted in more cases. References to more operations, victims, and offenders were included in letters discovered in the Sullivan basement. While some of these leads led to successful prosecutions, others ended in dead ends or circumstances where insufficient evidence could be gathered in time. The discovery that the Sullivan operation had been but one component of a much bigger system of exploitation that had gone mostly unnoticed for decades was among the case's most unsettling elements. According to the research, children have been bought and sold like commodities throughout American history. Comparable networks have existed in other parts of the country, and the legal and social systems have not been able to adequately safeguard society's most vulnerable citizens. The case also demonstrated how important community duty is in stopping these kinds of crimes. Millbrook's residents, who had spent 20 years living close to one of the most horrifying crime scenes in American history, grappled with feelings of remorse and introspection. How could they have been blind to what was going on? What indications had they disregarded or overlooked? If they had been more watchful or skeptical, could they have avoided the suffering? These inquiries sparked more extensive conversations regarding communities' duties to protect their most vulnerable people. The Sullivan case turned into a warning about the perils of believing that respectable looks equate to moral behavior, accepting explanations without more research, and protecting privacy when doing so allowed abuse. Beyond the immediate legal and social reforms it sparked, the Sullivan case had a lasting influence. The investigation's thorough documentation, which included bank records, testimony, and correspondence, proved to be a priceless tool for learning about America's history of exploitation and criminality. For years, criminologists, historians, and social reformers would examine the case in order to comprehend how systematic evil could thrive in seemingly normal societies. The Sullivan family's reign of terror was ultimately ended by the plain bravery of regular individuals who refused to overlook clear indications of trouble, not by clever police work or cutting-edge investigation methods. Rebecca's resolve to testify in spite of her trauma, Sheriff Crawford's readiness to consider community concerns seriously, and William Hutchinson's choice to report what he had heard. One of the most heinous criminal organizations in American history was finally revealed as a result of these individual acts of moral fortitude. For more than a century, the cellar where 47 children were discovered shackled has been shut off. However, the memories of their agony never cease to serve as a reminder of the value of compassion, bravery, and alertness in defending those who were unable to defend themselves. The Sullivan case serves as a reminder of the strength of personal conscience to overthrow even the most established structures of abuse and exploitation, as well as a monument to human wickedness. You can see why these troubling periods of American history must never be forgotten if this narrative has made you shiver. The depravity in locations like the Sullivan farm deepens our comprehension of how evil can conceal itself behind honorable facades, just when we believe we have seen it all. Share this video with a buddy who likes dark mysteries if this narrative is making you shiver. Please click the like button to show your support for our work, and remember to subscribe so you don't miss any more stories like this one. Together, let's uncover the remaining mysteries hidden in America's past. This story demonstrates how evil frequently poses as respectability and how those who seem most normal to their communities may commit the most heinous acts. How do you feel about this tale? Do you think the Virginia hills still hold mysteries, or do you think all was made public? Post a comment below. Please hit the notification bell, subscribe, and tell a mystery-loving friend if you like this story and would like to see more horror tales like it. We'll be here to unveil all the secrets that lie within the shadows of American history. I'll see you in the upcoming video.